Do you seriously believe this barrier was built for the sake of peace? Look at it through the eyes of a prison guard, and you will see the perimeter of the largest prison in the history of the planet, one that the authorities are still trying to camouflage with bushes and earth. While tourists trample the polished surfaces of restored steps, the real wall in the remote mountains tells a sinister truth. Official Beijing has spent decades feeding the world tales of a great shield, but the facts scream otherwise. In Shanxi province, hundreds of pyramids that dwarf those of Egypt are being systematically covered with soil and planted over with forests. This is not negligence, it is a global scrubbing of the past. The Great Wall is merely a part of this process, a grandiose line of isolation created not for defense, but for the total control of space. We are forced to look at an achievement so that we do not notice the traces of a civilization that was erased from memory under the watch of the guard. But why waste the resources of empires on construction in the void? The answer is buried in the foundation, which is located where no sane commander would ever choose to hold a defense. Nomads on horseback storming vertical cliffs. This cheap lie was invented by those who have never seen real mountains and do not understand how cavalry fights. The official version claims the wall protected against the lightning raids of northern hordes. But look at the terrain. Massive sections of the wall are laid along the crests of the highest ridges, where even a man on foot gasps for oxygen. Why build fortifications where nature itself has already created an impassable barrier? Nomad cavalry relies on speed and maneuver on the plains. Riders need pastures and watering holes, not sheer peaks where an army becomes an easy target for ambushes. Dragging thousands of horses through these passes is tactical suicide. Any Khan would have simply bypassed the mountains through the steppes, striking at the defenseless lowlands. Yet the builders stubbornly climbed the cliffs, sacrificing millions of lives for stones in the clouds. If the wall was not an obstacle for cavalry in the mountains, then whom was it actually meant to stop? The true goal of the architects was so terrifying that the laws of military logic had to be rewritten for its sake. While the Chinese spent decades laying brick after brick, their mortal enemies simply stood by and watched. Do you believe in such politeness in a war where the survival of nations was at stake? Any construction project of this scale is a perfect target. According to official history, the nomads survived by plundering China, and the wall was to deprive them of their livelihood forever. In such a situation, any sane leader would have thrown all their forces into sabotage, burning forests, destroying supply caravans, and slaughtering workers on the march. Yet the chronicles maintain a suspicious silence. This grandiose project, requiring colossal logistics and millions of man-hours, proceeded under conditions of almost resort-like tranquility. It is as if the nomads vanished on command, allowing the enemy to bolt the doors to their own home. This isn't war, it's a theatrical production where one side pretends to build and the other pretends not to care. But the lack of attacks from the hordes is only half the trouble. The real paradox begins when we look at those who supposedly guarded this construction. If the army was so strong, why did they need the stones at all? You have an army capable of guarding thousands of kilometers of construction in wild mountains for years, yet you still need a fence. Something clearly doesn't add up in the empire's accounting books. To erect this colossus, millions of workers were required. To ensure these workers didn't flee and weren't massacred by nomads, a covering army surpassing any enemy force was necessary. Historians claim China was weak, which is why the wall was built. But that is absurd. If a country is weak, it cannot protect a construction site of such length. If, however, the army is so powerful that it can control every meter of the mountain border for decades, then the enemy is already defeated. Such a military machine is, in itself, the best shield. Wasting resources on laying millions of tons of stone while possessing invincible legions is like building a concrete fence around a tank division. The logic of generals is powerless here, but the logic of wardens explains everything down to the last brick. After all, if the army stood upon the wall, it wasn't guarding borders. It was guarding a perimeter to ensure their own didn't scatter. Archaeologists have spent years digging in search of traces of great battles, but they find only a ringing void. Where did the iron, bronze, and the bones of millions of warriors, supposedly storming these walls, evaporate to? Centuries of continuous combat, as the textbooks insist, should have turned the foot of the wall into a landfill of artifacts. Imagine clouds of arrows, fragments of armor, thousands of fallen horses and men. The earth ought to be saturated with metal and packed with mass graves. Yet the reality is shocking. The cultural layer around the wall is suspiciously clean. There are no giant cemeteries for the hordes, no layers overflowing with weaponry. It is as if the blood of invaders was never spilled here, and the grand sieges existed only in the imaginations of court chroniclers. Where are the material proofs of a war that allegedly lasted for centuries? This archaeological silence is becoming deafening. If there was no external war, then the towers and battlements served an entirely different, far darker purpose, hidden from the eyes of posterity. In the Imperial Archives, you can find a report on the purchase of 10 bags of rice for a remote province. But regarding the main construction project of humanity, there is a suspicious vacuum. Who erased the memory of millions of builders, and why? Chinese bureaucracy has always been the gold standard. Every official sneeze and every copper coin was recorded. But when it comes to the Great Wall, we encounter an informational black hole. There are no detailed estimates, no names of genius architects, no schedules for material deliveries spanning thousands of kilometers. The most expensive and labor-intensive project in history was implemented under such a regime of secrecy that it was as if they weren't building a fence, but a bunker for the salvation of the elite. Compare this with European chronicles, where the construction of any cathedral is documented day by day. Here, there are only generalities and legends. This isn't a random loss of documents. It is a total scrubbing of evidence to hide the true face of this monument. But stones cannot lie as skillfully as men. When historians close the archives, the engineering structure itself begins to speak, and its confessions are enough to shock any fortification expert. An engineering error or a death sentence for their own people. Here is a shock you can verify for yourself. On vast stretches of the wall, the loopholes are not aimed at the hostile north, but deep into China itself. A military axiom is simple: fortifications are built facing the enemy. However, on the abandoned sections untouched by restorers, a chilling picture emerges. The firing points, battlements, and platforms for archers are turned 180 degrees, facing south. This cannot be dismissed as builder stupidity or coincidence. The project was overseen by the empire's greatest minds, and every brick was laid under strict supervision. The soldiers on these towers weren't keeping mythical nomad hordes in their sights. They were targeting their own fellow citizens. The wall was not a shield, but a front line deployed against the inhabitants of the Celestial Empire. It was a stationary army of wardens, ready to suppress any movement from within. If the loopholes faced their own people, it means they were perceived as the primary threat. But the wall was not merely a firing position. Its very form eliminated any possibility of escape for those trapped inside. From the outside, it looks like an obstacle, but from the inside, it is a sentence without the right to appeal. Look at the wall's profile, and you will understand. This is not a defensive rampart, but the wall of a giant mousetrap. Researchers who have risked reaching the abandoned, wild sections of the wall have discovered a terrifying engineering asymmetry. On the outer side, the side where the enemy was supposedly expected, the wall often has a gentle slope and rough masonry with protrusions. If one desired, even a physically untrained person could scramble up it. But once you look at the inner southern side, reality hits you in the gut. Here, the wall turns into a perfectly smooth, sheer vertical. Without ladders or climbing gear, it is impossible to scale it from the Chinese side. The structure was designed with cold calculation, to let anyone in from the outside, but to turn an escape attempt from the inside into guaranteed suicide. Now, all the scattered facts fall into a single puzzle. The wall is not a shield, it is a perimeter. But who exactly were the emperors so desperately trying to keep in this stone sack, stripping them of even the slightest hope for freedom? Did you think this was a state? Wake up. What you see is history's first correctional colony, the size of a subcontinent, where millions of people were turned into lifelong prisoners. When you piece together the inward-facing loopholes and the impenetrable inner side, the picture becomes crystal clear. The Great Wall is not a nation's pride, but its prison bars. The vast territory of the Celestial Empire was enclosed by a perimeter that turned the life of every subject into an existence under constant surveillance. For the average resident, the horizon ended not with a beautiful view, but with jagged stone and the cold glint of crossbow bolts. Every morning, millions woke up in the crosshairs of watchtowers that perfectly covered the internal territory. This was a total control zone where the very thought of escape shattered against a smooth vertical wall stretching into the sky. The scale of this containment zone staggers the imagination, but it brings us to the ultimate question. Who or what did the emperors consider so dangerous that they chose to lock an entire civilization behind this fence? Why waste lives on executions when you can simply erase millions of people from reality? The wall became the instrument of the most massive social castration the world has ever seen. The most rational, and therefore the most terrifying. Theory suggests that the territory behind the wall was turned into a giant reservoir for defective human material. Undesirable classes, political opponents, entire rebellious provinces, or peoples who refused to bow to the new regime were driven into this stone sack. This was not merely exile, but eternal imprisonment in a labor hell from which there was no return. The Great Wall served as a guarantee that the virus of freedom or dissent would never leak back into the sterile empire. Millions of lives were thrown into the furnace of this project, solely to turn the rest of the country into an obedient and manageable herd. But what if the prisoners were not humans, but something far more ancient and powerful? The facts suggest that the fence was built not against subjects, but to hide the traces of those who owned this world before us. What if those we call the Chinese are merely invaders who locked the true masters of the land in a stone enclosure to claim their history as their own? The mysterious Chinese pyramids, which the PRC authorities so fanatically disguise as hills, point to the existence of a much older and more powerful civilization in these lands. It is possible the wall was erected as the finale of a bloody population replacement. After a long conflict, the remnants of the indigenous culture, the true builders of the megaliths, were pushed north and sealed away by this colossal fence. The wall was built not for protection against wild nomads, but for the genocide of memory. Information about its construction was erased so that no one would know. China's greatest structure is actually a cage for those whose greatness the new masters of the Celestial Empire could never surpass. It was an informational and physical vacuum, turning ancient titans into forgotten ghosts. The truth was so monstrous that it had to be scorched from the chronicles for millennia. But even today, looking at the wild sections of the wall, one can feel the breath of this great secret we are forbidden to know. Official history is merely a bright facade hiding a gruesome mechanism of suppression. Are you still ready to believe the fairy tales in textbooks after what you have seen? Loopholes aimed at their own citizens, smooth inner walls that eliminate escape, and the total scrubbing of archives are not random coincidences. This is the signature of a system that built not a wonder of the world, but a monument to its own fear. The Great Wall of China is a grandiose curtain, behind which undesirable peoples, true history, and mysterious pyramids, still camouflaged by forests, have been hidden for thousands of years. We have been conditioned to admire the scale of the stone so that we do not notice the scale of the lie. The true purpose of this colossus is the eternal isolation of the truth, which the emperors chose to wall up in the mountains just to maintain power over minds. We have only lifted a corner of this veil. Study real photographs of the abandoned sections, look for inconsistencies, and ask questions. What other truth have the authorities covered with earth while you were looking the other way? Truth always leaves traces. You just have to stop believing the glossy guidebooks.